illnesses, that by that time I was close to 8 children, but the 8th child came along and I realized that I had better judgment about when to call the doctor for my kids by having served that time at the Children's Hospital. So that's my justification for the experience that I had, which was wonderful. And I saw a lot of childhood diabetics at that time, and they were doing great. So after I graduated, I went into research, and under the tutelage of Professor Best, who was one of the co-discoverers of insulin, I did some important original work in a particular hormone that was the neighbor of insulin. We now know that insulin and this neighboring hormone, glucagon, are opposite numbers, and they tend to play off against each other, but the glucagon story wasn't fully understood. So with his help, we had some glucagon available and found out the mechanism of how glucagon could raise the blood sugar compared to how insulin lowered it. And thereafter, I worked for 25 years in the Banting Institute. The Banting Institute, named after the co-discoverer of insulin. I was doing research part-time, and I was doing practice part-time. And that's not an easy thing to do nowadays, because research is so complicated, and people who have to go into research have to, in a sense, divest themselves from controlling patients' well-being, because they can't keep up with both. Well, at the time that I was there, the research that I was doing was simple enough that even I could practice medicine without becoming overwhelmed with the necessary knowledge. In the course of the time I spent in research at the Banting Institute, I managed to analyze the structure and function of the master gland of the body, namely the pituitary gland. And this was very well received by my peers. In fact, here I was, not a bona fide scientist. I was being recognized as the master of pituitary structure and function. I was invited to international meetings, and it gave me a thrill, but I realized that I was operating under false pretenses. I wasn't a scientist, and I couldn't spend my life in science because I liked looking after patients. So a couple of things that happened on the way up. I was treating diabetic patients at the clinic at the Toronto General Hospital, and I found some who did not respond to the usual amounts of insulin. Now, insulin was a life-saving hormone, but they often needed 5 or 10 times as much insulin as the average diabetic, run-of-the-mill diabetic. And I sought the help of one of the men who had helped to purify insulin for use in humans, and he solved the mystery. He said, these patients are reacting against animal insulin. So that is, at that time, we were just giving pork and beef insulin. We didn't have the modern availability of human insulin. And they were developing what we call antibodies by the immune system, which blocked the access of insulin to the cell surface where it was supposed to be acting. Well, anyway, this made a big impression on me. The concept of insulin resistance was something that I believed in firmly. And when we came a few years later to know that we could measure insulin in the blood with a very sensitive test called radioimmunoassay, it was discovered, as had been suspected some time but not proven, that there were 2 kinds of diabetes. One that was very sensitive to insulin, and the other that was quite resistant. Now, the childhood diabetics, the pediatric diabetics, were quite sensitive to insulin, but the overweight older people were not. And diabetes, in a sense, ran in my family. My grandmother had diabetes, but she was older and somewhat overweight, and she was handled by a small amount of insulin with no problem. But there are other people who, when we tested these insulin, with these patients who were what we call type 2 diabetics. The type 1 diabetic is the young child. The type 2 diabetics classically are the adult onset diabetics. But we tested the amount of insulin in their blood. There was more insulin than we would have found in a normal person. And yet, at the same time, the childhood diabetics had none. And that's why they couldn't survive without insulin. So the question arose, why was it that patients who were overweight diabetics had more insulin than they should? And they didn't have antibodies. They were not the kind that we were familiar with from our original research. But they seemed to have a source within the body of antagonists to insulin. And about 20 or 25 years later, we found out from work done at the Rockefeller Institute that there were chemicals in fat, in abdominal fat in particular, that blocked the action of insulin. Now, insulin, I think, has still a pride of place in the treatment of diabetes, but as we learn from time passing, that insulin could have a dark side, a demonic side. It seemed to facilitate heart disease and other complications that we were not used to blaming on insulin, but I came to the view that patients did best when they were well controlled in their blood sugars with the least amount of insulin. So, having run out of lubrication, I'm going to take this. So, the least amount of insulin was arrived at by a low carbohydrate diet. And now, low carbohydrate diets have had a considerable run of favor. In the last 10 years, that's the major kind of diet that's being prescribed. But when I used a low carbohydrate diet to reduce the amount of insulin and allow fat to come out and be used for energy, I found that it only worked for a while. That is, every diet, including my diet of a low carbohydrate insulin reducing diet, had a short sort of shelf life, that within a couple of months or 6 months or a year, whatever weight has been lost with the low carbohydrate diet would invariably come back again. And I reasoned that there had to be some explanation for this. And the explanation appears to be something that we cannot find in ordinary blood tests. This is why it's eluding most doctors. And I think that if you want to know what our secret weapon is, it's the recognition that the brain has a lot to do with overweight. Now, this is, forgive me for being complex, but the brain runs everything in the body. And it does so by virtue of its capacity to control the final function of the brain with 4 chemicals called neurotransmitters. And these chemicals are under the direction of a primary neurotransmitter called serotonin. And the issue here is that those chemicals that direct the body are not measurable in blood tests. So I thought that something was going on in the brain that we couldn't measure in blood tests that was making people stop losing weight and not being able to. It has to do with the most important chemical, serotonin, which governs sleep, the depth and restorative quality of sleep. Now, sleep is not a simple matter. Most people don't understand, thought to it, what constitutes becoming unconscious. And if you're unconscious, you can be at a very superficial level and it doesn't really help. But when you have a deep level of restorative sleep under the influence of adequate serotonin, then everything comes back into balance. So serotonin appears to be the critical sort of key to the understanding of persistent overweight. When people are up and around and doing mental and physical work, and we can measure in animals the same circumstances being obtained in them, the actual amount of these chemicals in the brain, as we can't measure them in human subjects, we find that there's a small drop of all of the brain chemicals. And at the end of that day, the function of sleep in the night that follows is to bring back to normal the level of all of the neurotransmitters. Now that's fine, that happens readily when you have a normal amount of this important chemical, serotonin. But what happens when you don't have enough serotonin? And how does that happen? Well, serotonin is depleted by stress. And stress can be of all kinds. It can be even good stress. But the fact is, stress interferes with sleep initially, and then finally, when you interfere with sleep, you don't have serotonin enough to restore that sleep, and ultimately, you end up running on empty. Now, here's where I think something should be said. People who are resistant obese patients frequently, in fact, almost invariably, have a carbohydrate addiction. And they are actually carboholics. And carboholics are driven by a craving that is as powerful